So I'd like to thank all my co-authors on this project, of which are many different organizations, and it's been a wonderful collaboration that started in late 1990s, really. So what I'm going to cover today are just three topics. I'm just going to have a very, very brief introduction to the Kirtland's warbler. Then I'll give you a summary of some of the research results as we think it applies to application for conservation. And then I'll talk very briefly about some tentative potential conservation actions based on the research that we've been conducting since 2002. So first, we'll start out with just a barest overview of the Kirtland's warbler. Unfortunately, Pete Mara covered some of this morning. The Kirtland's warbler breeds almost entirely in Michigan, with a few outlying populations in Wisconsin and Ontario. Winters almost entirely in the Bahamas archipelago, with a few outliers in Cuba, Bermuda, and elsewhere. The migration route is shown in these red lines, and that was the geolocator data that Pete Mara referred to earlier that Nathan Cooper has been collecting, and an incredibly valuable addition to the work that's been done in the breeding grounds and the work we've been doing on the wintering grounds here in the Bahamas. I'm going to focus entirely on the wintering grounds, the very basic findings that we have found, and how we think those findings, again, can be applied for conservation efforts. So the Kirtland's Warbler Research and Training Project, which is the project we started in 2002, had three major goals. It was to describe winter habitat for wintering Kirtland's warblers, build conservation capacity in the Bahamas, and Scott and Zico are wonderful examples of some of the outcomes of this conservation capacity building, and then to develop socioeconomically viable management guidance for the Kirtland's warblers here in the Bahamas archipelago. What we have found is that Kirtland's warblers that were captured through mist netting occur primarily in an early successional habitat. In the lower left-hand side of the slide, you can see some of the earliest successional habitat used post-disturbance, as little as 3 years following disturbance to at least 30 years post-disturbance in the image on the right side of the slide. The birds use habitat that has been cleared and abandoned, and also cleared and then grazed by goats, the two most important types of disturbances that we have seen in captured Kirtland's warblers. They are also associated in this young coppice with particular fruiting plants. The black bars in this graph illustrate the number of plots in which Kirtland's warblers were captured, with each of the three fruiting plants illustrated at the bottom of the slide from left to right: snowberry, black torch, and wild sage, and then comparing the number of birds captured at other plots where those plants were not found. So you can see there is an association with those three plants. And there the plants are named. We've also found, by conducting vegetation surveys at random plots in South Eleuthera, that many of the relative abundance of black torch and wild sage is relatively high on those plots where there's been goat browsing. We've also found that the birds, especially in late winter, move from food-poor to food-rich sites. As you know, the winter in the Bahamas becomes progressively drier, resources in shorter supply, and the birds respond by moving. When they move to food-rich sites, as indicated by the green bars there, which show the food resources to areas that the birds moved, and they both higher in ground arthropods and in ripe fruit. Subsequent to the intensive ecological work, this is a summary of 10 years of work, mind you, so it's a very quick overview. We have also been doing surveys for Kirtland's warblers throughout the archipelago. What we have found is that the birds, the highest numbers of birds, have been found in the central Bahamas, and in particular on Eleuthera, Cat Island, San Salvador, and Long Island. Last year, as an example of some of the work we did last year, we were on Abaco. Last year, we spent 3 weeks there, found 3 birds at one site, and no birds the rest of the time. We covered the island from north to south. By contrast, the next week we went to Cat Island. We found over 40 birds in 7 days. So in summary, in the ecology of the Kirtland's warblers, they occur in early successional habitat, roughly at least 3 to 30 plus years since disturbance. They appear to occur predominantly in sites with black torch, wild sage, and snowberry. They prefer resource-rich sites in late winter. These are frequently associated in areas where the water table is relatively high. They will shift sites as resources change, and they appear to be most common in the central Bahamas. So this leads to trying to develop a conservation program. And admittedly, we're a long way to coming up with a finalized conservation plan, but we're getting some ideas how we might proceed. So I'm breaking it out into three basic categories: habitat protection, how we can create and maintain early successional habitat and in a sustainable way, both at a site and a landscape scale. The landscape scale is important given the fact that the birds move, and also how we increase awareness of the Kirtland's warbler. Without public support and interest, it'll be very difficult to protect the bird here. So starting out with habitat protection, it's kind of the most straightforward in the sense that we think we need to protect areas that have recurring natural disturbance and few anthropogenic threats in the central Bahamas. And that these sites would probably best also be sites that have other conservation and socioeconomic values. The possible mechanisms, including government land designation, such as creating new national parks, purchase of other lands that may not be a national park, easements, or management agreements. Pretty standard approaches to habitat protection, but all of this would have to be done, of course, within the context of conservation priorities of the Bahamian government and organizations here in the country. Now, one example of where we might look to protect habitat is where storm surges are likely to occur after a severe hurricane, a Category 5, at high tide. So if you look at the west side of Eleuthera on the north and then the west side of Exuma, these are all areas that are subject to particularly strong storm surges. They're therefore not particularly good areas to put development. But these storm surges, as has been discussed earlier in the conference, are also areas where you can set back succession as plants may be killed, and also, as Zico indicated, the shrubs resprout. And it is those shrubby areas that are used by the Kirtland's warblers. So these may be the kinds of areas that meet socioeconomic needs as well as those of the Kirtland's warbler. Here's a simple image that shows on the left the coastal coppice on parts of Eleuthera prior to a storm, and on the right after a storm. So we set the succession back, keep out the taller trees, and then the Kirtland's warblers, which are typically within 1 or 2 meters of the ground in this very dense shrub, will continue to use that habitat over time. And black torch is a pretty common component of this coastal coppice. We also need to avoid areas where there are other kinds of anthropogenic coastal disturbances or threats. And Kathleen Seeley's published a paper fairly recently where she described areas in the central Bahamas that have been altered by physical restructuring, such as canals, vegetation loss from sand dunes and sand mining and dump sites, development, and also where native species are being replaced by invasive species. So she did a ranking of parts of the central Bahamas where the Kirtland's warblers were concentrated, and going from the bottom of the table on the left column from Cat Island down through Eleuthera, south, central, Exuma, and Long Island, there was a range of rankings for these anthropogenic disturbances, and each island has quite a range. But if you look at the most frequent ranking for each of these islands, you'll note that Eleuthera South has the highest number of sites that she sampled with no anthropogenic threats. So this is perhaps a logical place to begin at protecting habitat. This is also an area where we found a lot of birds, so it's a good, happy coincidence. Now, that isn't to say that we don't want to look at protecting sites on the other islands, because we do have this whole range. But it does suggest, because we have both site-specific and landscape considerations, that South Eleuthera may be particularly attractive as an area to protect habitat. But that's not going to be the whole picture. Protection can't do it alone. We know we're going to have to create and maintain habitat and do it in a sustainable fashion. So we need to consider a variety of factors when doing that. One is it has to be done at a large enough scale to be effective. It should be done at a minimal cost, given all the other competing demands for resources here as anywhere else in the world. We also have to complement other ongoing socioeconomic activities and other conservation work. There are a number of ways that habitat can be created. We've talked about some of the natural processes like hurricanes, storms, surges. Fire is both anthropogenic and also natural, but as others have already commented, there's a much higher incidence of anthropogenic fire than before. And then we have these sort of bizarre sorts of disturbance regimes that benefit Kirtland's warblers, like bulldozing and slash and burn agriculture. Over time, succession proceeds, and we get the suitable Kirtland's warbler habitat at the bottom of the slide here, and the PVC pipe there is approximately 3 meters tall, to give you some reference. Now, one possibility is working with the Bahamas Electricity Corporation, their rights-of-way. They obviously need to clear the rights-of-way in order to have no disturbance to the wires during storms and so forth. So we've talked with them a bit, and what they're doing is actually pretty good for the Kirtland's warblers. We've done surveys under the rights-of-ways on Eleuthera. We've found black torch and wild sage under the rights-of-ways and Kirtland's warblers. It also is a potential corridor that could take birds to other suitable habitat. And we've seen birds basically follow some of these rights-of-way corridors in parts of Eleuthera near Tarpon Bay. So this is one potentially viable way in which there is no additional conservation cost. Now, another one is even more bizarre than bulldozing, and that's goat management. Normally, goats on islands are a complete anathema. However, as I mentioned, we found Kirtland's warblers in areas that are browsed by goats, and we've commented on this at the last conference. So they could have a potential role in maintaining the rights-of-ways under utility corridors if it's done periodically, if it's done carefully, if it's very well controlled, and in that way we might be able to support more Kirtland's warbler habitat. We've done a little bit of experimentation with setting up some experimental plots with the goats, and they do take it all down. In fact, they also eat black torch and wild sage, which we're a little surprised at. But it also resprouts very quickly. We've done some, also, Genie Fleming has done some experiments and found they resprout very quickly, and following cutting, which simulates browsing, they produce fruit within a year in some cases. There is a market for goat meat, and so we made one attempt to get a business plan to figure out how this might work. It hasn't been done yet, so if anyone is interested in developing a business plan for goat management, we're wide open for your expertise. Another possibility is sustainable agriculture, and the One Eleuthera Foundation will be talking with next week. They are taking a strong interest in sustainable agriculture on the island, and so there may be some ways to incorporate ensuring that some of the fruiting species used by Kirtland's warblers get incorporated into this kind of a practice. Also, private landowners can play a role, especially some of the larger resorts that own a lot of land. And we would be interested in talking with some of the larger resorts. Maybe they can manage early successional habitat, or again, perhaps plant wild sage black torch. The problem is at such a small scale, it may or may not be effective. So it would have to be done with a resort that has a lot of property and that it's an economically viable enterprise. The Rock Sound Club in Eleuthera near Rock Sound, and we've worked with them for a long time. When Eleuthera is working on this property now, they're interested in ecotourism, so we may be able to bring several elements together which would favor conservation of creation of habitat for Kirtland's warbler. Another one is invasive species management, in that the casuarina along the coast is a big problem, and it especially might want to look at eliminating it in South Eleuthera, where there are very few anthropogenic threats, there are lots of birds, and it's a lot of wild sage and black torch. So we want to be careful where we do it, because there's so much casuarina, you can't do it everywhere. Another one in the upper right hand is jumby bean. It comes in, especially after the rock has been pulverized, and it overtops and shades the wild sage and black torch. So locally, we may want to eliminate some of the jumby bean, even though it's a valuable forage for goats. And Brazilian pepper on the lower left is another one that comes in locally, and rubberweed also is one that's coming in at one of the best Kirtland's warbler sites we know of in the country. Now, another big problem is that Kirtland's warblers are not particularly showy. They're one of the category of chimneys. So no flamingos, no Bahama parrots. So the Kirtland's warbler looks like the Bahama warbler on the upper left. It looks like the magnolia warbler on the upper right, or the palm warbler on the lower right, or the prairie warbler on the lower left. So just being able to identify the bird is a real challenge for most people, let alone the Kirtland's warbler in the center, which just melts into the shrub. There's so few birds that people hardly ever see them. So it's not an easy one to get a lot of people galvanized and excited about. However, we are making outreach attempts to do that. Really applaud BNT for their Discovery Club efforts, where they begin to highlight the Kirtland's warbler and in the context of other Bahamian species. We've also been working over the past few years, last 10 years, on developing what we Kirtland's warbler calendar, where school kids from both Bahamas and Michigan submit entries. The entries are selected. They go into a really nice calendar that then gets distributed back into communities in Eleuthera and Michigan, thus emphasizing the connectivity as well as the conservation needed in both areas. And the Leon Levy Native Plant Preserve has also been interested in working with us on some of these issues as well. So we plan to talk with Ethan next week and others at the Native Plant Preserve. Also, outreach to adults is important, so there's been discussion of having PSAs on TV and across the country. And BNT has also produced some Kirtland's warbler posters that have been at least put up at airports in Eleuthera and government centers in South and Central Eleuthera. Another possibility to get more interest and some economic input coming in is through ecotourism, a rapidly growing endeavor throughout the world. And BNT and National Audubon Society are starting a very innovative program to train guides throughout the country that can also then incorporate conservation for the Kirtland's warbler. And the Ministry of Tourism in the country has also shown an interest in bringing in the Kirtland's warbler along with Bahama parrot, flamingo. So I really applaud them for coming on board, for picking up on a shimmy to bring into the ecotourism business. And there's a lot of ongoing ecotourism in the country, and I mentioned a few that I'm aware of that are working in the country, and each one of those organizations has also shown interest in helping with the conservation of the Kirtland's warbler. So I'm hoping that this will all continue to grow and get more people interested in the bird. We also know that you're not going to sell ecotourism in the Bahamas on Kirtland's warblers. There's got to be other birds that go along with the package. So it'll be important with these ecotourism efforts that take place to emphasize things like the great lizard cuckoo in the upper left, which is found on Eleuthera at many of the same sites as Kirtland's warblers, the ubiquitous bananaquit, red-legged thrush, Bahama yellowthroat and endemic, the greater Antillean bullfinch in the lower right, Bahama woodstar, lower middle, Lysagras thrasher, Lysagras flycatcher in the lower left. So all these come along. And they all co-occur with the Kirtland's warbler. So, in summary, we think these are some important components of what we need to do to protect Kirtland's warblers in the Bahamas. One is habitat protection. We think Eleuthera is a particularly important area for protection to take place, and possibly also San Salvador, Cat, and Long Island. I emphasize Eleuthera simply because we've done a lot of work there, and our knowledge base is best there. Habitat management by working with the Bahamas Electricity Corporation right-of-ways, possibly goat farming, perhaps national parks that are established with Kirtland's warblers in mind and other associated species and communities, and private sites by working with resorts and others. And building constituency is important, the outreach to schools and the general public, property owners where their Kirtland's warblers, or especially where they occur in relatively large numbers and relatively consistently, and helping others develop these ecotourism efforts and help bring in and fold in Kirtland's warblers with flamingos and Bahamas parrots. So I'll end on that note.